May 1945. Bavaria lay silent under a pale sky. The war was over, but its ghosts still wandered through the valleys and along the ruined roads. At a U.S. Army processing camp near Augsburg, a group of captured German female officers stood behind barbed wire, their faces drawn, their gray-green uniforms stripped of insignia. They had served in the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, and even the SS auxiliaries, women raised in a system that taught them obedience, purity, and the superiority of their nation and their gender's domestic role. Then a sound broke the stillness, the growl of a jeep. Dust rose on the road as two American military police vehicles rolled in. From the passenger seat stepped an American officer, and beside her a woman in uniform. She wore a pressed olive jacket, polished boots, a service cap with an eagle emblem. Her posture was confident, her stride unflinching. She carried herself like an equal among soldiers. The German women stared in silence. Some blinked, others frowned, unsure what they were seeing. One of them, a former Luftwaffe aide, whispered, "Eine Frau." In uniform? Her voice trembled, and as realization sank in, some began to weep, not from fear but from a confusion they could not yet name. In the final months of the war, the Third Reich was collapsing under its own weight. Cities burned, railways lay shattered, entire divisions surrendered in disarray. Yet within the dying empire, even as men vanished into the east or west, many German women continued to serve with unbroken discipline. They were the clerks in bunkers, the radio operators in air defense posts, the nurses in field hospitals still tending to the wounded long after victory was impossible. Their world had been built on duty, a duty shaped by ideology. Since the 1930s, German womanhood had been defined not by ambition, but by obedience. The Nazi vision of the ideal woman was captured in a single phrase: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Women were expected to bear sons for the fatherland, to serve men, to embody purity and devotion to the nation. Yet as total war consumed Germany, the same state that had confined women to the home began drafting them into the machinery of war. By 1943, over 500,000 women wore military or paramilitary uniforms. They staffed anti-aircraft batteries, decoded messages, and operated telephones for the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. They became known as the Helferinnen, female auxiliaries. Their roles were meant to support men, not rival them. But in the ruins of the Reich, the lines blurred. Some were issued pistols. Others managed logistics in frontline command centers. In Berlin's final defense, young women from the Bürgerwehr took up rifles beside elderly men, defending a city already lost. Still, in the eyes of Nazi doctrine, they were not soldiers, merely servants in uniform. They could work but not command. They could support but never lead. To show authority, to stand beside men as equals, was unthinkable. It violated everything the regime had built its image upon. When these same women became prisoners of war, they carried those beliefs like invisible chains. They surrendered their weapons, their rank insignia, and unknowingly, the illusion that had guided their lives. The first encounters between captured German female officers and Allied servicewomen began in May 1945 in camps across southern Germany. At places like Bad Aibling, Regensburg, and Augsburg, the U.S. Army established temporary holding centers for female military personnel. These were not concentration camps. They were transitional facilities, designed to identify those connected to the Nazi Party, screen for war crimes, and repurpose harmless prisoners for reconstruction work. The American guards who managed these camps came from a world utterly different from the one their prisoners had known. Many were young women themselves, members of the Women's Army Corps known as the WWII. By the end of the war, more than 150,000 American women had served in uniform. They were clerks, drivers, radio operators, and mechanics. Some had crossed the Atlantic under bombardment to serve near the front lines. Others had flown in the Women Air Force Service Pilots program, ferrying aircraft across continents. They wore the same khaki jackets as men, drew official pay, and earned military rank. When the captured German women first saw them, disbelief turned to quiet astonishment. To them, a woman in command uniform represented a contradiction, a violation of everything they had been taught about order, gender, and worth. One U.S. Army report from June 1945 described it simply: German female prisoners express shock and emotional distress upon realizing the authority of American female officers. Many display confusion and tears. They appear to experience this not as threat, but as disbelief. To understand why that moment struck so deeply, one must return to the roots of Nazi ideology. From the earliest years of the regime, German women were taught that their highest honor was motherhood. Organizations like the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, trained them to be healthy, obedient, and ready to serve the future of the Aryan race. They learned discipline and sacrifice, but never independence. The propaganda of the era exalted them as guardians of purity and tradition, not as individuals capable of leadership. Even during the height of the war, when necessity pushed women into factories and military offices, Joseph Goebbels and other Nazi leaders continued to denounce the idea of gender equality as a poison of democracy. Hitler himself had once said, "A woman must never be man's competitor, but his helper." The Allied world, by contrast, had already begun to shift. In America and Britain, total war had drawn women into nearly every sector of life. Factories filled with female welders and mechanics. Nurses worked on hospital ships under fire. Intelligence units employed women in code breaking and analysis. In 1944, American WWII officers were commanding hundreds of men in logistics units, with full military authority recognized by law. So when these two worlds collided in the spring of 1945, the emotional impact was profound. At the Augsburg camp, one German signal officer, barely 27, was recorded saying, "We never imagined a woman could salute and be saluted." Another recalled, "They wore their uniforms differently, not as costume but as pride." Witnesses described how, on the first day of processing, an American female lieutenant addressed a group of prisoners in fluent German. She ordered them to line up, check their belongings, and await inspection. Her tone was professional, not cruel, yet the sight of a woman giving orders to both men and women stunned the prisoners. Some of the older German officers stared in silence, others lowered their eyes, overwhelmed by a mix of humiliation and awe. A U.S. Army interpreter later wrote, "It was the first time many of them had seen a woman treated with respect and authority. It broke something inside them, a realization that the world they had served no longer existed. But this was not a story of cruelty or punishment. It was a moment of awakening. The German women, once proud servants of a dead empire, found themselves face to face with what the modern world would become. They saw in these American women a reflection of freedom that had been denied to them all their lives. Behind the fences, conversations began to change. Prisoners whispered questions about education, about pay, about how these American women could rise through rank. They asked if they were married, if they had children, if their husbands approved. The answers, calm, factual, unapologetic, left them silent. In their quiet confusion lay the beginning of understanding. That power need not corrupt womanhood. That equality did not destroy respect. Reports from the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division noted that these interactions did more to dismantle Nazi gender propaganda than months of re-education lectures. Observation of American servicewomen among the German female officer class caused immediate cognitive dissonance, one report stated. They have begun to question the social order they were raised to preserve. Even some American officers were struck by the contrast. Captain Elizabeth Newcomb, a WWII officer stationed in Bavaria, wrote in her diary, "The German women still carry themselves like statues, proud, rigid, untouched by war. But when they see us, uniforms wrinkled, hair pinned back, doing our jobs, something changes in their eyes. They look as though they've seen the future and it frightens them." The war had ended, but for many of these women, the true battle had only just begun. The battle to reconcile who they were with who they could have been. From disbelief came envy. From envy, reflection. And in that reflection, the seeds of transformation began to take root. The shock of seeing American women in uniform was not just cultural, it was existential. It shattered the image of the obedient German woman that the Reich had spent 12 years constructing. It opened a door into a world they had never imagined possible, and beyond that door, history was waiting to be rewritten. It began as disbelief, a silent, stunned recognition that everything they had been taught about womanhood was wrong. For the captured German female officers, The image of an American woman in military uniform was not merely foreign. It was impossible. In the ideology that had shaped them, authority, confidence, and public strength were male domains. Yet now, as they stood in POW camps behind wire and watched American women command soldiers, drive trucks, and issue orders, the unthinkable unfolded before their eyes. The camps where these encounters occurred were modest, functional, and temporary, part of the U.S. Army's vast network across occupied Germany. At Augsburg, in a requisitioned airfield, hundreds of German female auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht had been processed. Most were administrative or communication staff, though some had served directly in field command offices. Among them were women like Oberhelferin Gertrude Müller, who had operated radio transmissions for the German 6th Army, and Lieutenant Hilde Sasse, who managed personnel files at a Luftwaffe depot. They were disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to the structure they had known. To these women, the sudden collapse of the Reich had already felt like a personal disintegration. Their uniforms, once symbols of precision and honor, had been stripped of insignia. Their ranks meant nothing. Their commanders were dead or imprisoned, and now, to add to the confusion, they were being addressed by American women, confident, direct, unafraid to speak to male soldiers as equals. One of the earliest reports from the 7th U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division captured the moment clearly. Female German military personnel express visible distress when encountering U.S. women in uniform. Several wept openly. Psychological cause appears rooted in cultural and ideological shock rather than fear. For some it was humiliation, for others, revelation. In post-war interviews, several former Luftwaffe clerks admitted that the experience shattered their worldview. One recalled, "I thought the world had turned upside down. We had been told that a woman's power was in her beauty, her devotion, her silence. But here stood women who were neither silent nor ornamental, and the men listened to them." The American women, for their part, were mostly unaware of the depth of this impact. They were simply doing their jobs. A WWII lieutenant inspecting captured documents at Regensburg later wrote, "We didn't see ourselves as symbols. We were tired, we worked hard, and we just wanted to finish our assignments. But the Germans looked at us like we were from another planet." In those camp yards, two worlds collided, one born of obedience, the other of opportunity. The difference was not just in uniforms, but in posture, in voice, in the way each woman saw herself in the world. The German prisoners carried an ingrained reverence for male authority. They were taught that respect was shown through silence. The American women, by contrast, operated on an assumption of equality. They joked with their male colleagues, debated logistics, and expected to be obeyed, not because of gender, but because of rank. It was this normality that unsettled the German women most. An American interpreter noted in his field diary, "They, the German women, don't understand how our girls can wear trousers, smoke, or talk to men as comrades. They call it shameful. But I think what they feel is envy." The envy was subtle, but it was there. Beneath the tears and confusion was an unspoken awareness that these American women were free in a way they had never been. In the ideology of the Third Reich, femininity had been weaponized. Women were praised not for individuality but for conformity. They were mothers of soldiers, caretakers of the home, symbols of racial purity. Even those in uniform, the Helferinnen, had been carefully contained within limits. The Nazi regime had resisted female emancipation, viewing it as a threat to social order. While American women joined the WWIIs and waves, German women were kept from combat, their authority confined to clerical tasks and nursing duties. The meeting between these two worlds exposed the hollowness of that system. During interrogations, some captured female officers expressed confusion not only at the presence of American women, but at the way male soldiers treated them. "They call her ma'am," one prisoner observed of a U.S. lieutenant. "A man salutes her as if she were his superior. In Germany, this would be shameful, but here it looks natural." The use of that single word, natural, appeared repeatedly in the records. For the first time, these women were witnessing a version of respect that was not dictated by propaganda or fear. It was professional, earned, reciprocal. This difference echoed through every part of the post-war encounter. When German women saw American servicewomen driving supply trucks or managing logistics centers, they realized that the concept of a woman's place had been a fabrication of control. Even more startling were the nurses and medical officers who moved confidently among male patients, commanding authority with calm precision. At a U.S. Army hospital near Stuttgart, where German POWs were treated, a female American medical officer oversaw the triage ward. Witnesses recorded how a group of German nurses, now prisoners, watched her with silent awe. One whispered, "If such a woman had served in our army, the men would not dare to shout." In that quiet remark lay the collapse of an entire ideology, but it was not only the German women who learned from these encounters. American officers, too, began to understand the psychological weight of propaganda. They saw how deeply the Nazi system had shaped its women, not as fanatics but as captives of belief. One WWII major wrote to her superior, "They are obedient beyond reason, apologetic even when they have done nothing wrong. It's as though they have been trained never to think of themselves as full persons." This observation would later inform aspects of the Allied re-education program, which sought to reconstruct not only Germany's political structure, but its moral and social foundation. In this sense, the meeting of American and German women was more than cultural contrast. It was the first step toward transformation. Yet for the women inside those fences, the process was deeply personal. Many wrote in diaries smuggled out of the camps or recounted their experiences years later. One, a former SS communications aide, recalled, "I did not hate them. I hated myself. I had believed everything I was told, that women must serve, not lead. When I saw her, the American officer, I realized that I had served a lie." Her confession was not unique. Across the POW camps, similar sentiments began to surface. Quiet, hesitant, but genuine. Historians now see these interactions as some of the earliest sparks of post-war gender reform in Germany. When the country began rebuilding, many of these same women entered the workforce, pursued education, and questioned the roles they had once accepted without thought. The emotional collapse of 1945, born from seeing women in positions of strength and equality, became a catalyst for change. But in that moment, standing behind barbed wire stripped of rank, and watching American women move freely in uniform, the feeling was less about progress than loss. It was the mourning of a world that had defined them, and the slow birth of one that would not need to. At night, in the quiet barracks, the German officers would whisper among themselves, "Do they have husbands? Do they go home? Do men respect them?" The answers when they came were always the same, yes. And every time, silence followed, long, heavy, introspective silence. Those questions would echo for years. In the wreckage of the Reich, beneath the ruins of cities and ideologies, something subtle yet profound had begun to change. The women who once saluted swastikas now watched a different kind of salute, one that carried respect, not fear. That sight, simple, silent, and undeniable, would haunt them more deeply than defeat itself. Because for the first time, they saw what freedom looked like, and realized it had never worn their uniform. The days that followed deepened the fracture that had already begun inside them. The camp routine was methodical. Roll calls at dawn, work assignments, debriefings with Allied officers. But for many of the German female officers and auxiliaries, the true interrogation wasn't the one held across tables under fluorescent light. It was internal. Each day they saw the same faces, American women in khaki and olive drab, walking confidently among men, clipboards in hand, voices calm but commanding. These were not women of the Bund Deutscher Mädel. They did not stand in rows singing hymns to purity and obedience. They gave orders. They laughed openly. They moved as if they belonged to no one but themselves. For the captured German officers, that sight was unbearable and mesmerizing. One morning at the Regensburg holding facility, an American WWII lieutenant named Helen Bishop entered the administration hall. She was there to inspect the POW manifest, a dull procedural task. But to the women seated at the tables, it felt like a revelation. She strode in, saluted the male officer beside her, and began giving instructions. The male sergeant obeyed without hesitation, not out of fear, but respect. For the German women watching, the gesture tore through years of conditioning. To see a man respond to a woman's authority not as submission, but as routine, unsettled them deeply. Witness accounts recorded that several of the German prisoners turned away, unable to look. One wept quietly. Another whispered to her neighbor, "Our men would never allow it." Helen noticed the tension, though she could not understand it fully. Later, she would write in her journal, "They stare at us like we're ghosts. I think we scare them, but not the way soldiers do. We frighten something deeper, what they've been taught to believe." The WWII women themselves had come from a nation that had only recently begun to accept their place in uniform. Many faced skepticism back home. But here, in these camps of defeat, they became living contradictions to Nazi ideals, proof that a woman could serve with dignity, intelligence, and command without losing her femininity or respect. The contrast was not lost on the male prisoners either. German men, stripped of rank, saw American servicewomen giving orders with authority. It was humiliation of a different kind, but for the German women, it was revelation. For the first time, they understood that the humiliation was not theirs. It belonged to the falsehoods they had been made to serve. Interrogations revealed this quiet shift. American officers conducting interviews with German female personnel noticed subtle changes in tone over time. In early sessions, the women spoke with pride about discipline and sacrifice. They referenced duty to the Reich and service to their commanders. But by midsummer 1945, something began to waver in their voices. They no longer spoke of Hitler with conviction, nor of destiny. When asked about their beliefs, many replied with hesitation. In one recorded transcript, a German Luftwaffe aide, identified only as Frau W., said, "I did not know women could serve this way. In Germany, we were told it was unnatural. That democracy makes women unclean, unfeminine. But your women, they are clean, strong, and free. I think now that we were made small so that men could feel large." The Allied interrogator paused before responding. Her words needed no correction. They were confession enough. Meanwhile, the American women in the camps began to notice the small, quiet gestures that marked change. German prisoners who had once avoided speaking to them began to approach with questions, not about politics, but about life. How did they join the army? Were they married? Did they have children? Could they work after the war? The curiosity was tentative, almost fearful, as though even asking was an act of rebellion against everything they had believed. One of the most striking accounts came from a British WWII, Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer visiting a U.S. camp near Stuttgart. She recorded, "When they saw me enter with wings on my jacket, they stood as if saluting a ghost. One asked if I had ever flown. When I told her I had ferried aircraft, she covered her face and began to cry. That moment captured what no lecture could teach. The realization that a woman could be trusted with power, with danger, with purpose. The old order, built on submission and hierarchy, had crumbled, not by force but by example. In that collapsing silence, the transformation became irreversible. Some of the German women began to mimic the Americans, subconsciously at first. They straightened their posture, walked with less hesitation, even attempted a smile in greeting. A few began to ask for work assignments outside the barracks. They volunteered for translation duty or camp administration. One interpreter noted, "They no longer carry themselves like prisoners. They carry themselves like students." But for others, the confrontation was too painful to bear. One SS communications aide refused to eat for 3 days after being processed by an American female officer. "I cannot be commanded by a woman," she said through clenched teeth. Yet even in her defiance, the foundation of her certainty had cracked. When Allied psychiatrists later studied POW behavior, they recorded that many German women experienced what they called identity disorientation. The collapse of ideological structure had left them hollow, but the exposure to a new kind of freedom, embodied in the American women, began to fill that void. And it wasn't only ideology collapsing, it was emotion, long suppressed beneath layers of propaganda and fear. One late afternoon in June, a storm swept across the Augsburg camp. Rain battered the tin roofs and soaked the yard. In one of the barracks, a group of German women huddled under blankets, shivering. When the storm subsided, a young American WAC corporal stepped in, carrying dry towels and rations. She set them down without speaking, just nodding. One of the German officers, older, her hair streaked with gray, looked up, her lips trembling. She murmured softly in English, "Thank you." Then, unexpectedly, tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't crying out of gratitude. She was crying because she understood something profound. Compassion from an equal, a woman in uniform, meant more than pity from a victor. It was recognition. The shift spread quietly. In those brief exchanges, a towel passed, a smile returned. The ideological armor of the Reich dissolved. These women had served a nation that glorified strength and scorned tenderness. Now, they were seeing that real strength could coexist with humanity. Reports from the military government's Women's Affairs Division began noting behavioral change. Among female detainees, hostility decreases rapidly when engaged by American servicewomen, one report stated. There is evidence that exposure to equal gender authority produces greater cooperation and emotional stabilization. It was no coincidence that many of these women would later play vital roles in post-war Germany's reconstruction. The same former auxiliaries who once typed orders for a fascist regime would go on to teach, to nurse, to govern local offices under the new democratic framework. And many credited their transformation to the months they spent in captivity, to the moment they saw another kind of womanhood in action. But at the time, it was not pride they felt. It was grief. They grieved for the years lost under lies, for the education they never received, the freedom they never knew they could have. They wept not only for the dead, but for the selves they had been forbidden to become. And as they stood behind fences watching American women drive past in jeeps, laughing with their comrades, the image burned into them, not resentment, but yearning. It was in that yearning that the war truly ended, not with surrender, but with awakening. Because no bomb or treaty could destroy the Reich's mythology of womanhood as completely as one simple, undeniable truth: a woman could wear a uniform and still be free. The war had already ended in formal terms, but for the German women who now lived behind fences in Allied-run camps, another battle had just begun, one that would shape their souls far longer than the war had shaped their bodies. In the months after the surrender, the transformation among female prisoners became a quiet undercurrent across Europe. It spread not through orders or propaganda, but through the smallest human acts, through decency. At camps like Ludwigsburg, Darmstadt, and Garmisch-Partenkirchen, reports from the U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division described a phenomenon they hadn't anticipated. German women, once hardened by ideology and loyalty to the Reich, began exhibiting shifts in speech and behavior after prolonged contact with Allied female personnel. They no longer spoke with the tone of indoctrination. They asked questions, timidly but sincerely. The daily rhythm of captivity was simple but revealing. At dawn, the guards would open the gates to the courtyard. Women emerged carrying metal basins and gray blankets, their once pressed uniforms reduced to shapeless prison garb. Yet among them, subtle changes began to show. Hair combed neatly, improvised ribbons made from torn cloth, posture less rigid, more human. American guards noticed. And unlike the narratives they had been raised on, of a cruel enemy, of fanatic loyalty, what they found instead were human beings stripped of illusions. In August 1945, the Office of War Information conducted a study on female POW behavior across U.S.-controlled zones. One finding stood out. When treated with ordinary respect by American personnel, German female prisoners demonstrate rapid behavioral adaptation. Defiance diminishes, morale stabilizes, and self-awareness increases. That line, treated with ordinary respect, would become one of the quiet revolutions of the post-war world. For many of these women, the shock of being treated kindly by the victors felt more disorienting than defeat itself. They had been taught that Allied soldiers were beasts, that captivity would mean dishonor, humiliation, perhaps worse. Yet what they encountered were women who offered soap and towels, food and words, not contempt, the very act of being addressed politely. Miss, ma'am, Frau, unsettled their understanding of hierarchy. To the American and British guards, it was simple discipline. To the Germans, it was an awakening. Letters written years later by former female POWs often spoke of that first encounter with respect. One named Liesel wrote from Hamburg in 1948. They looked us in the eye when they spoke to us. They did not look through us nor above us. It was the first time I felt seen, not as someone's property, not as a servant of the state, but as a person. In many cases, it was American women who became the bridge between defeat and rediscovery. The Women's Army Corps, the Red Cross, and the U.S. military government's women's affairs officers all interacted daily with German civilians and POWs. They ran medical stations, food distribution posts, administrative offices, often under conditions of mud, scarcity, and ruin. Yet their presence symbolized something unprecedented. Female authority grounded not in ideology, but in competence. The German women watched closely. When an American nurse entered a barrack with medicine, the prisoners observed how she spoke to male doctors without fear. When a WWII officer drove a jeep through the camp gates, her posture behind the wheel seemed almost alien. A woman commanding a machine, moving freely in the open air. These were images that the propaganda of Goebbels had forbidden. In the Reich, the woman's place was within walls, in a mother, caregiver, supporter. Here, the woman's place was wherever she chose to serve. And that realization, though born in defeat, became a spark. For months, these women lived between two worlds, the old obedience and the new uncertainty. Their daily work assignments forced them to confront it constantly. Some were tasked with laundry for Allied troops, others with cooking or administrative support. In each task, the lesson repeated: discipline without degradation, service without subservience. A few dared to speak of it among themselves. Late at night, after curfew, whispers spread through the barracks. "Did you see the American women today?" One would murmur. "They speak to men like equals." To which another might answer softly, "Maybe one day we will too." Outside the camps, the same transformation was rippling through the ruins of Germany. The occupation forces, though harsh in Reconstruction policy, brought with them a model of society utterly foreign to those who had grown up under National Socialism. Women could work, women could vote, women could lead. In September 1945, the Allied Control Council began organizing local German administrations to stabilize the economy. For the first time, women were appointed to municipal councils, rationing offices, and welfare boards. Some of these women had been POWs mere months earlier. Others were widows or former party clerks now eager to rebuild a broken nation. And though they seldom spoke of it publicly, many traced their strength back to those days of captivity, to the quiet example of the women in American uniform who treated them not as enemies, but as equals. Still, the road was not smooth. Shame lingered like dust in the air. Many former female officers found themselves ostracized in post-war Germany, distrusted by civilians, distrusted by the new authorities, haunted by their past service. They faced a question that no tribunal could answer: how to live with the self that had once believed. Psychological studies from the early 1950s, conducted by Allied rehabilitation teams, noted that guilt among female POWs often expressed itself differently than among men. Where men spoke of lost honor or failed command, women spoke of wasted years, of obedience mistaken for virtue. Yet within that guilt, something enduring took root: humility. And through it, resilience. A former Luftwaffe secretary named Anneliese told an interviewer in 1952, "When the Americans asked us to cut our hair and wash, we felt humiliated. But later I understood. They were making us begin again, not as soldiers but as women. It was mercy disguised as order." Mercy disguised as order. Perhaps that was the essence of their rehabilitation. By 1946, the camps began to empty. One by one, the women were released into a country they no longer recognized. The cities lay in ash, but beneath that ash, a new world was forming. They carried what they had learned like invisible seeds. When they returned home, they spoke differently to their daughters, their neighbors, their sons. They no longer repeated the language of purity or obedience. Instead, they spoke of dignity, of respect, of possibility. Some joined the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who rebuilt Germany brick by brick. These women, once defined by uniforms and insignia, now found strength in labor. They cleared streets, carried stones, and organized relief for the hungry. To passers-by, they were symbols of survival. To themselves, they were symbols of rebirth. American and British photographers captured their faces, lined, tired, but determined. They no longer looked away from the camera. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The posture of women who had learned what freedom looked like, even when it came from the hands of their former enemies. In the broader arc of history, these transformations rarely made headlines. There were no parades, no speeches. But they mattered. When post-war West Germany later drafted its constitution, the Grundgesetz, one article stood out, Article 3, "Men and women shall have equal rights." That line, many historians note, owed its existence not to ideology, but to experience, to the women who had seen equality in action inside Allied camps and carried that vision into their new democracy. For them, liberation did not come through conquest or protest. It came through recognition, through the realization that dignity, once given, could never again be unseen. And so, the legacy of those female POWs became intertwined with the moral reconstruction of Germany itself. Their tears, shed in humiliation and awakening, watered the fragile roots of a new nation that would one day define equality, not as weakness, but as strength, and from the ashes of a collapsed empire, the faint outline of a different future began to appear, one built not on obedience but on understanding. The war had taken everything from them, homes, nations, illusions. But for many of the German women who had once served in the Reich's shadow, defeat became something else, a mirror. When they first stood behind barbed wire, stripped of rank and certainty, they believed their lives were over. Yet in that quiet aftermath, when the smoke of war cleared and only the human face of compassion remained, they saw a world they had never been shown, one where power was not cruelty, where authority could coexist with grace. They saw women commanding with intelligence, not fear. Women respected for service, not obedience. Women trusted by men, not owned by them. It broke something inside them and rebuilt something new. In the years that followed, many never spoke of their captivity again. But within them, something had shifted forever. Their silence was not forgetfulness. It was reflection. For in that silence, they carried a truth more enduring than any uniform. That humanity, once recognized, cannot be unlearned. The war had been fought to destroy tyranny. But for these women, its end had destroyed something more personal. The myth that freedom belonged only to men. Their story does not end with liberation or triumph. It ends with understanding, with the realization that sometimes the most profound revolutions are not fought on battlefields, but within the human heart. And as the decades passed, the images of those women, once prisoners, later citizens, faded into the archives of history, but their transformation remained, quietly shaping a world that was learning, slowly, painfully, what dignity truly meant. Because in the ruins of war, when the guns fell silent and compassion stepped forward wearing the same uniform as authority, humanity rediscovered itself. And in that rediscovery, the women who once wept behind wire became symbols, not of defeat, but of awakening. The war ended in 1945. But for them, and for countless others who saw humanity survive amid ruin, it never truly ended. It simply changed form, from conflict to conscience, from destruction to understanding.